Donald Trump had the same policy as Biden. He was the one who gave the tanks to Poland, and he was the one who was going to have Fort Trump named after him. I mean, he was very, very big on this for whatever reason he had. And the Russians looked at him as a threat. I mean, there's this idea that he had a rapport with the Russians. Well, it's hard to have a rapport, but he did something the Russians really didn't like. They didn't trust him. In war, you sometimes like a wild man because he's not careful. He overestimates his capability. I don't think Trump did either of those things. I think they looked at Trump, paid very little attention to what he said, and took a look at the things he did. I mean, he did some really important things in building American power in that region. And so, the idea that he was projecting, the sense of being unpredictable. But in fact, Obama started arming Poland. Trump continued it, and Biden went on. America is much more consistent than it likes to think of itself as.
Do you think he would have invaded if Trump were president?
He invaded because U.S. forces were 260 miles away from Moscow, and he was building up his forces to do it. The invasion of Moscow from Moscow was a multi-year effort. So if he invaded when he did, he was building his army years before, and he was. And everybody said, well, he was just doing it for fun or something like that. Putin is a smart man. He's not emotional, and he knows what his country needs. He needs the Americans who he regards with serious respect away from Moscow. And so it was not, from his point of view, president.
The average Russian patriot, the average Russian Putin supporter, truly believe that America would invade Russia?
The answer is that they miscalculated on what Hitler would do, or what Napoleon would do. The Russians are chess players. They don't guess on what your move is going to be. They get ready for the worst-case scenario, because that's what they're used to. That's what the United States should do, too, which is hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
And there would have been no invasion of Russia. Why all of a sudden was it imperative to invade Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it was all of a sudden. They had taken Crimea. They were a dominant force in the Donbass in the east, okay? They were constantly making moves, but they were also building their military. Remember, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian military went to pieces, and Putin was carefully building the option. I don't think he was committed to this, okay? But what he basically saw was this build-up in Poland. That was the thing that people forget. The U.S. was building up its forces, putting 82nd Airborne into Poland, more than that. And he's saying, why are the Americans doing this? And this predated Trump. It went on during Trump. So he was looking at this and saying, I've got to build up my force. And I don't think he built up his force big enough. I think he underestimated. When I went to Russia, every house has a picture of somebody who died. It's an amazing thing and a painful thing to go to these houses. That war still lives. It was, I think, some 30 million Russians killed. So, yeah, they do respond to it.
What is the worst case scenario that can come from this conflict? Likely, or feasible, not likely. What is a feasible worst case scenario?
That we wind up unable either to defeat the other side, one or the other, okay, and unable to make a peace. I'm not worried about nuclear weapons. I'm not worried about many other things. But the worst case here is one of these endless Vietnam-style wars that go on and on. That may not be the worst thing in the world, but that's what scares me. Because what I see is a Russian force that is, you cannot simply defeat them without them coming back at you. And the Ukrainian force fighting for its life and wanted to be there, and the U.S. committed.
So do you think that Putin expected the resistance that he's getting?
No. I think he made three massive intelligence failures. First, he failed to understand Ukrainian training level and motivation. Second, he didn't understand that in a war, Germany was not going to play ball with him, work with the United States, taking Europe with him. And finally, he simply miscalculated on what the United States was going to do. He thought he could move rapidly in, occupy Ukraine, provide a reality, and the U.S. would kind of back off. So I don't think he ever anticipated this.
Did he think he could annex Ukraine? Was that his aim?
Well, he saw Ukraine as incapable of putting up resistance. What he does with the Ukraine, and I think we really have to understand this importance, he has the borders of the Soviet Union back. He faces in Europe, and anyone who wants to hurt him, and Putin believes the United States is planning to hurt him, anyone has to go a lot farther. So he gets, firstly, his western frontier secured. He winds up putting the position where the Americans have to be on the defensive rather than him. And he also gets into a new relationship with the Europeans, with Germany particularly. Germany gets the oil there.
Your view is that because Germany was so reliant on Russia for energy, it would not oppose his invasion of Ukraine.
That Schultz, in the first 2 days, did what Putin expected him to do. He looked for a way out. He looked for it. He flew to Washington. He had a meeting with Biden and some other people, and he shifted his position. We showed that, we have various things that he needs more than the Russians. So there was this moment where could have happened. It was not an insane idea. So the thing about Putin was he was wrong, but he was not ridiculously wrong. He needs more than that. He needs the Donbass. There's a region on his border that really is predominantly Russian, the only part that is, that he had influence over and that the Ukrainians attacked and tried to take back. I think we could have a settlement if Ukraine agreed to cede this area to the Russians. Well, it comes down to this. If the United States tells the Ukrainians, we're going home, enjoy yourselves, okay, a lot of things become conceivable. So one of the things that's going to happen here is we're going to have a locked-in war going on. And at some point, the president or someone is going to say, this is not going to end, and we can't spend all our time here. And they'll look for the concession. Now, there may be a different concession, okay? But I think this is what the Russians could accept, some territory. They need that. And I think there's a limit. You and I both know there's a limit to the tolerance of the American people for endless wars.
What was the status of the Donbass region prior to the invasion?
It was part of the Ukraine formally, but in practical terms, it was governed by the Russians who dominated the area. Ukrainians didn't left them alone. The Russians didn't worry too much about what they did. And it was a region that it was, on the map it was Ukrainian, but it was really Russian. So it was one of those ambiguous places because he's got a lot of people dead, and they have to die. That by itself is the status quo ante. You can't have all these people dying just to restore what was there. So he's going to want that, but he's going to have some sort of symbol that says this war was worth it. Something. For 20 years, the Ukrainians weren't in NATO. That was the status. Putin used to talk about the importance of them NATO creeping and so on and so forth. But, it was something that didn't happen. So the status quo is not what he's going to accept. Remember, he has a big problem. He has two armies fighting. One is called the Wagner Group, which is larger now than the Russian army, and they're under the control of various oligarchs. And these two armies are out there, and slowly Putin is losing control over what's going on or having to negotiate with people. So his power is slipping. He needs a settlement.
Do you think that, nevertheless, that is the most dangerous situation in the world today, or is there something we're overlooking?
Well, I don't think it's dangerous, because if Putin launched a nuclear attack 30 minutes later, he'd be dead, because we could track him pretty well, and you can count on that. So everybody avoided nuclear war because it was impossible to have one without being badly damaged yourself. And that's the same thing here. But it's good to talk about it. I mean, the really difficult thing here is we're going through a period of time where there's a global economic downturn. We have these every 8 to 10 years. But this time it's with a lot of countries that have very weak governments and are greatly unsatisfied. The possibility of, I won't call it global unrest, but I will say in strategic countries no longer be able to control their public and themselves, that's my fear. An example is that in a country like Hungary, which I was at, and I know you're friends with Viktor Orban, and I am too, that you have a person holding it together, but they're under pressure from the economies of the European countries and so on and so forth. And at a certain point, the pain becomes more than can be resisted. I picked Hungary only because I was there recently, but it could happen in any country. It could happen a lot of times. As you look into the 1920s, and that was what the world looked like.